Hello, everyone, and hello again for the introduction. So I'm super excited to be able to offer this fireside chat conversation with Bratin. Before we get started, each of us will just quickly introduce ourselves so that everyone who's watching this know who's in the room, and also people here know who we are. So my name is Iavor Bojinov, or Yav. I'm a faculty in the Tom Group at HBS, where I work on data science strategy and operations. Edward and I have a research lab that's part of Cubed on data science and AI operations, which really studies how companies can develop, deploy, scale algorithms. And this is essentially what we're going to be talking about. Edward, you want to quickly just...
Yeah, so Edward McFowland III, also a professor at HBS in the Tom unit. I study very similar things as Yav, which is why I built the lab together, which is why we're sort of co-having this conversation with Bratin around building both AI tools and deploying them in organizations and how that changes the underlying operating model, business model that organizations actually end up implementing.
And thank you, Yav. Thank you, Edward, for having me. I'm Bratin Saha. I run the AI and machine learning services at Amazon. We work at various levels of the stack, depending on what customers need. So there are some customers who say, hey, give us the optimized infrastructure, and we provide the machine learning infrastructure. Some that say, give us the entire machine learning tooling for the machine learning lifecycle, so we can focus just on the machine learning model. So we provide the tooling for them, which is SageMaker. And then there are some customers who say, give us the whole solution. So, you have customers like an Anthem or a Rocket Mortgage that say, give us a whole document processing solution. So we also provide the end-to-end machine learning solution for customers. So working across various levels of the stack. Most of the machine learning and AI today in the world happens on what my team builds at AWS. So you get a pretty broad perspective of where the industry is headed.
Perfect. So let's just dive into it, and let's dive into maybe the generative AI aspect.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that is a hot topic, and that's an understatement, probably. The hype is very much real, but I mean, just from your perspective, can you tell us a little bit about, is this really a technology that's revolutionary? And then also, how are people actually using it, and what does it really mean for us as business leaders?
Sure. So, the way I look at it is generative AI is really a continuum in the evolution of data science and how compute and data have been used for analysis. And I'll give you some data points to put this into context. If you think of the IT revolution, that drove the whole productivity gains over the last 20, 30 years, IT revolution was driven by Moore's law. And Moore's law said the amount of compute doubles every 18 months. If you think about AI and machine learning, the amount of compute is doubling every 3.5 months. Okay, and so you're moving at 5 times the speed of the IT revolution, which itself was pretty fast.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you look at the last 5 years, of the AI space. The last 5 years is almost the last 25, 30 years in IT land. If you go back 30 years, Amazon wasn't there, and Google wasn't there, and Facebook, and all of these weren't there. So part of what you're seeing is really this really rapid innovation, and this real rapid innovation is allowing us to put a lot of capabilities that are very capable. Now, I'll give you some more data points to show how capable these capabilities have become. When we, over the last 3 years, just over the last 3 years, the capability of these machine learning models, just over the last 3 years, has increased by 1,600x, 1,600 times in the last 3 years. That's a rate of progress that, frankly, we haven't seen. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to train these machine learning models with vast amounts of data. Now, an average human being, us, in the course of a lifetime, will be exposed or will listen to about 1 billion words, 2 billion words, let's say. Okay. When we train these models, we train them on trillions of words. So these models are having thousands of times the information that an average human will have in the course of the lifetime. Okay. Another way to look at this is if you look at Wikipedia. Wikipedia is about 18, 20 gigabytes. When we train these foundation models, these generative AI models, we are training them with terabytes of data, thousands of times what is there in Wikipedia. So as a result of that, you have these models that have truly remarkable capabilities, and I think they're going to be transformational in how every industry does this work. Now, yeah, you asked me about a few examples. I'll go into a couple of them. One is software development. I think today we have tools like Amazon Code Whisperer, where all the developer has to do is they have to put in comments in plain English, okay, and it generates the code for you. We have done studies that show that an average developer is about 57% more productive when they use these tools. Now, that's just one aspect of it, which is I'm a software developer. I don't have to write a lot of code. I'm just typing in comments and the code gets generated. But here is the key part of this, and here is what I think is really transformational about this. 3, 5, 7 years from now, Java or Python or Rust or C or C++ isn't going to be the programming language. The fun part is that English is the new programming language. And so what does it mean for society when everybody who can speak and read and write actually becomes a computer program? And you can imagine that we are not far away from a world where if you can go from English to software, you can go from Latin and Spanish and Chinese and Hindi to software. So what does it mean when everybody is a programmer? What does it mean to innovation? So in my team at Amazon and in a lot of our customers, they're using Amazon Code Whisperer for software development. And I think it's going to radically change software development. We recently also launched another product. This is in the healthcare space. And I take this example because, you would imagine healthcare, maybe a little bit, may not have adopted this. So it turns out that today when you go to a physician, the conversation has to be scribed and summarized and uploaded into your electronic health records. And that's because of regulations and so on. It turns out that the average physician ends up spending 40% of the time, scribing that conversation and looking at the summary and uploading it. So that's time that's not being spent on patient care. So we launched this product at Amazon Health Scribe that captures this conversation, uses GenAI to create a summary of it that a physician only needs to verify. Okay, and this should cut down the time spent by about 70%. So we are working with this on 3M. 3M is a partner on this, and 3M has, I think, the second largest network of physicians in the US, 300,000 physicians. Now imagine 300,000 physicians, once this gets deployed, we are cutting down the time spent scribing by 70%. That's a huge benefit in improving patient outcomes. So these are just a couple of examples, but what I wanted to convey is two things. Number one, this is really transformational. There is good reason that this is transformational given the advancements in the basic computer science. And I think this is going to permeate every aspect of our life. And, I just gave 2 examples there.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is absolutely amazing. Those 2 examples, the way I think of these examples is really changing the company's operating model, right? They're becoming a lot more productive. You can potentially imagine enhancing company scope, the scale capabilities to handle information. Have you started to see companies reinventing their business model around this as well? Or is this something that we're still trying to figure out?
I think there's a lot of companies thinking about that. Because the way you do business fundamentally changes with it. In many ways, generative AI, at the end of it, what we humans do is create. We are creative animals, or we are creative beings, right? And what we do is create. And I think for the first time, we now have a tool that can be an assistant in your creative process. And what that means is we probably can and should rethink how we do our work and be a lot more productive. And I think, the way I look upon this is one of the most transformational technologies. Probably the last one was the internet. And just like the internet is now an integral aspect of everything we do, the way we work and the way we live, and companies have transformed themselves with the internet, e-commerce and everything. I think this is going to be a similar thing where companies will just transform the way they work, and we will, it'll transform the way we live.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think this question around permeating each industry is really important. And so if I just take sort of the software development context, right? So is there any concerns though about sort of how, if everybody is using the same tools, then the productivity gains are going to be massive, but it may steer people to similar answers or things like that, right? Some of the benefits of differentiating between software development firms is the quality or the way in which they program or things like that. And so is there, while that productivity increases, is there any sort of drawback to that Amazon's seen or you're seeing or folks are seeing in the industry?
That's a good question. So, I'm glad you bring that up. So what is happening with these tools is, like, if you think of the creative process, right, which is software development, there are really two parts to this. One is you have thoughts in your mind, like, whether it's you're writing a paper, you're writing software, you're doing a painting, you're writing a book,
right?
There is some thoughts in your mind. And then you take those thoughts and you convert it into the output. In one case, you convert it into a program. In the other case, you convert it into an article and so on. What generative AI and what these tools, and especially Code Whisperer, is doing in the case of software development is it's automating the process of converting your thoughts into the code.
Okay.
So you as a developer are still kind of codifying your thoughts when you give it the natural language instructions. Like you say, hey, do this first, then do this, do this. And so that essence of creativity, which drives the differences, still exists. It's the part that automates the creative thinking to the output that gets automated.
So what are some of the biggest challenges you're seeing now in deploying this?
One is a lot of these generative AI models can hallucinate. And, they can give answers that are seemingly correct, and they can sometimes give answers that are not correct, but give it in a very, in a way as if it's correct. So I think hallucinations and the accuracy is really important. And making sure that these models are being built in a way so that they are, the responsible AI is integral to how that's being built. I think that's important. I think the cost and the performance is going to continue to remain important. And that I think is really critical. And there's a lot of work going on there, but that I think is going to be really critical in truly democratizing the use where it's just pervasive. So I would say, the whole accuracy aspect of it, the kind of responsible AI aspect of it, and the performance and the cost are really important.
Can I jump in on this?
Yeah.
So because the first point you brought up, I thought was really fascinating, right? So you started the conversation around the productivity gains and how, I can just sort of, say something in natural language and everyone becomes a programmer, right? Basically because of this tool. But then sort of on this backside, you made this comment about one of the critical questions and challenges is the fact that when you use this tool, it can hallucinate, create things that even to the best of eyes seem like it's correct, and you deploy it and there might be some issues. And so there is this tension with everyone can be a programmer, but everyone being a programmer doesn't have the skill to assess the hallucination or pick out this problem. And so by democratizing and making everyone a programmer, it seems like we are also giving everyone the opportunity to maybe create some challenging results or software. And so there has to be this tension here around that, I'm guessing.
Yes, and so there's a couple of aspects. One is the tools are going to get much better.
Okay,
and so
right.
Where I'm going with that is, if you draw the straight line between where we were 3 years back to where we are now to where we'll be 3 years from now, a lot of these errors will go away. That's one part of it. The second part of it is there are domains like software engineering where we are used to, like, there is a paradigm and a discipline around testing and validation, because humans also make errors. So we have into our workflow integrated the whole aspect around you need to do tests and you need to output the tests and so on and so forth. That's that aspect of it. And then there's the other thing, which is there are techniques being developed now, things like retrieval augmentation and other techniques that can actually be used to reduce the number of these errors. And then the other thing I'll also say is there is an aspect where the generative AI replaces the work that humans are doing, which I don't think is quite there, versus accelerates the work with human oversight. Right. And so if you go back to let's say the physician example, in that, the physician is doing the scribe or the scribe is doing the scribing and then the physician is to check it, versus generative AI creates it, and there are some, innovations we had around how you can quickly check the output. Okay. So that's a situation where we are saying something that used to take you an hour will probably take you 10 minutes. So we are going to make you much productive. So I think, at least in the near term, the paradigm is probably more of an assistant where there is still a human supervision there. And so it's really a productivity enhancer.
So this is a really interesting point, because you're seeing companies build these sort of internal bespoke models, but at the same time, you have general purpose LLMs that are available like Poe and ChatGPT. But then at the same time, you're seeing companies banning the use of ChatGPT. So where do you see this going? Is it that every company is going to build its own proprietary version for very specific tasks, or should all these companies that have banned ChatGPT just go back on that? And I think what's happening is almost like this, like shadow IT, and now it's shadow AI, right? Where you just have people using tools on their personal laptops and then just copy pasting onto their company laptop to get around it. So what are your thoughts on that?
So we have, one of the things, and it kind of gets back into the responsible AI domain. And this is, these are, I think, really good topics, especially, for D3 and your research, which is the model and data governance aspects of it. One of the things that we pay a lot of attention to at AWS is how do you make it safe and easy for enterprises to use these models? So one of the things we do that is different from what other providers do is when you are an enterprise and you are using one of our foundation models, and we provide that through Amazon Bedrock, which is a foundation model service, and that has a set of state-of-the-art different kinds of models. So when you use these models through Amazon Bedrock, what we do is when you try to customize it with your data, you get your own private copy of the model. So unlike some other providers where, as you're using the model and you're sending stuff to it, it's actually going into the base model potentially. And then there can be, leakage things and so on. In our case, when you are an enterprise and say, I want to use this and I may send my own data, you are actually getting your own copy of it that's in your virtual private network that no one else has access to. And that is, and all of the data transmission is encrypted at rest and in transit and so on and so forth. So that makes sure that you actually have secure ways of using it. And I think that is actually one of the key things that, the industry, and, I think this is a really good topic from governance and, what kind of mechanisms you should have, which is at least at AWS, we have really paid a lot of attention in how you make something enterprise ready. I'll give you another example. Think of the software example that I talked about, right? Now, when you're generating code, you want to make sure that the code you're generating has the appropriate copyright attribution, right? Like if it's a code that is similar to some open source code, you want to make sure that the right copyright gets generated along with the code. When we did our Code Whisperer, we were the first ones to actually develop a generative AI-based coding tool that not only emitted the code, but also emitted the copyright attribute to it. And there was a lot of work in making sure that happens. So it's a great question that you're asking. And I think that is the one point that I also wanted to get across, that there is generative AI, and then there is generative AI for the enterprise that needs a layer of guardrails and goodness and governance and controls. And, we at AWS are spending a lot of time on it. And those are actually, great topics. And, there's a lot of research work also that's going on. And those are great topics for research as well, from multiple perspectives, from the technical perspective and the process perspective, from the business perspective.
So I just want to go down that path
Okay.
on the policy guidelines. So we
Okay.
have a few
Okay,
questions
go ahead. Yeah,
online,
yeah, go ahead.
which are around this notion of, what are your recommendations for policy? Like, should companies just let everyone do whatever they want? Is it enterprise who should have control? Or just more broadly, like, what is your perspective on how these models should be governed and sort of the types of regulation that you see coming? I know you have a lot of experience speaking to the White House and other parties that are trying to govern on this. So what's
Yeah, so
the-
we were part of the White House. Amazon was represented by our CEO. He was at the White House unveiling of this. We were part of the set of recommendations that we agreed to in terms of the responsible use of this. One of the things, in fact, that is part of this is things like when content is being generated by these generative models, you want to watermark it. Yeah, so that you can distinguish it from other kinds of stuff. We have a acceptable use policy that our customers have to abide by, and we are very active with policymakers and others interested in this space. We are closely following a lot of regulations that are making their way through, and we think there should be some kind of framework that should be created for this. And we are actively giving our input to the policymakers.
Great. And let me do one more question here because it's getting quite a few likes, which is this idea around, there's some quotes have come out that in a decade, 90% of the content will be AI generated. First, do you think that's actually realistic and plausible? And then the second part of that question is this going to lead to LLMs collapsing because they're sort of just retrained on the data that they already generated?
I think there is, I think LLMs can be used for, regenerating content, and I suspect they will be used for that. And you can imagine, for example, today in a lot of scenarios, in fact, I was actually talking about this with some of the university faculty. Today, in many places, the amount of training data you have can be a bottleneck in doing some of this research. Now, you can imagine that you can use these LLMs to generate some of this training data and synthetic data and so on. That said, I think the other place that we are actually seeing quite a bit of movement is what I would call more kind of domain-specific LLMs. LLMs that are actually being trained on proprietary data. So think of it as, I'll give you an example. Think of it as, and you can imagine this is going to be there in enterprise productivity tools, where today, let's say, you are a paralegal in a law firm and a case comes in and you have to manually go in and search all of the cases and how did your firm represent it and so on. You can imagine that you would have LLMs where the paralegal can just say, hey, tell me all of the cases, what did we do and so on. So you need these LLMs to be trained on your proprietary data. So I think we'll also end up in a situation where we get a lot of, and this is not public data, this will never be public. So we'll end up in a situation where you use these LLMs in a variety of ways on public data, on proprietary data, and it'll just kind of evolve in that way.
We had some questions maybe out here in the audience here as well, so I want to maybe turn it. Yeah. Well, please go ahead.
Fascinating conversation. I'm curious, the examples you gave, I loved when you talked about the efficiency of programmers, and I'm curious, are most of the applications on this productivity side, which is can be a fancy way of saying cost reductions, are there any revenue generating stories that you have around some of the use of Gen AI?
I think, there's a lot of, if you're able to get more done, you're ultimately generating more revenue.
Perfect.
So I think there is stuff around customer service where, you can actually get a lot of that. You can provide better recommendations, more targeted stuff that can uplift your revenue. There is, on the revenue generating side, there's a lot of work going on. In fact, Notion, they actually are building on us where you can use LLMs, they use LLMs to generate early drafts of stuff, right? And you can imagine, going forward, if you're a marketing analyst, you want to create the first draft of a marketing campaign or all of these, where you are really using it again as a creative assistant and you're subscribing to it and generating revenue that way. So I think you're going to see kind of the straightforward revenue attribution parts of it. You're going to see kind of the efficiency aspect of it. You're going to see the efficiency aspect leading to more getting done and hence generating revenue aspect of it. And then there'll be these completely new business models and products that will emerge that, we aren't even thinking about.
Yeah, great question. One of the things that I think is really interesting around this as well is the business model innovations always take a lot longer than the operating model innovations, right? It always takes us a while to be able to reimagine what that future looks like. But in terms of how it's impacting people's jobs today, it's already happening, right? And we're starting to see almost the shift from being like content creators to being like content managers. So I'm just curious, when you think about these LLMs, what are the sort of implications on us as individuals who in the future are going to be we're going to have to work with algorithms? How is that going to change our jobs? How is that going to change the skills that we need? And how, if we're automating large parts of our jobs, potentially that could mean that either companies can fire a lot of people or they can change the roles that they do. So how should we approach this as individuals?
No, I think there are two parts to this. One is, I think some of the more tedious parts will get automated. And pretty much, everyone feels like, they don't have enough time to do all the work they want to do there, right?
Yeah.
So I think, you'll end up getting more bandwidth for focusing on the more valuable parts of the thing. The other thing that I also think is ultimately technology has been a force for good. One example, that I like to often use here is what Amazon did with its fulfillment centers. We automated a lot, we added robotics, we were able to get the job done much quicker. And as a result of all of that automation, we were able to serve a lot more customers than we otherwise would have served. That in turn created a lot more jobs as a result of it. So ultimately, what I think is maybe the nature of work will change a little bit, but there is a flywheel effect that gets created that ultimately leads to net benefit, aggregate benefit for society.
Go ahead. I was going to go to a question here that's sort of connected, but go first.
So just to sort of dovetail off this though, so I like to think about sort of the devil's advocate ideas, right? So this idea of we're using these LLMs to help create and generate ideas, but you saw, or I saw, and I think the world saw some creative people like actors and writers being like, well, but like, what does the content then belong to? Is it mine? If someone uses this thing to help create content similar to mine or different from mine, and so how do you think we should in your conversations with organizations, how do we navigate that tension? Because it will make me more productive, but it makes Iavor more productive, and Iavor can then create things that maybe look a lot like what I would create. And again, there's this tension of
you saying I'm copying your.
I would never say you copied it. No, joke. But you can add, right. So the most salient example is right is like writers who say now you can write a book like in my voice, in my style, or artists. So how do we navigate that?
I think these are all good questions which is why, onto the earlier question on policy, I think, we probably will work through some of these details.
Okay.
At the same time, I'll kind of throw back a question, which is, you're training a model and it's giving some output. But as a human being, also, I'm reading papers, I'm seeing paintings, I'm learning from it as well.
Sure.
Right. And so there's an aspect of learning that has gone into me by reading other people's works. And so It's not totally obvious to me, but I think these are all questions that will probably need to be worked out.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a hard question, and I think this is where, I mean, this
Like,
is,
has my writing style been influenced by all of the novels and the newspaper articles I read? Probably,
Almost
sure.
guaranteed it has, right?
Yes.
And it's in very subtle ways that you don't recognize, so you don't have this sense of attribution because it's not clear, but it does affect you.
yeah, but also, I mean, in academics, right, we're both professors, and the way we probably learn how to write, at least the advice I was given was find a paper that you thought was well written
And write like
and
that.
just copy how that's written. Of course, you use your own ideas, but you're trying to emulate a voice that you think is good. But I think this is where lawyers are essentially going to have to come in and help us draw that boundary, right? What's plagiarism versus what's being, new ideas inspired by. And I think it's really hard because
And how you attribute the whole thing. And by the way, that's also where I was, talking to Iavor this morning about this. That's also where I think a place like Harvard, because you have such a strong, computer science presence, a business presence, a law presence, a public policy presence, this probably requires that synthesis of ideas where it can contribute a lot.
No, absolutely. I think you need this broad coalition of different ideas to try to think this through.
I'm interested in the economies of scale issues around deploying these technologies for productivity enhancements. And so if you take your example of a 57% productivity enhancement, could a single coder go get that type of improvement on their own? If you have a group of 50, it's cost effective to go after that type of productivity enhancement. Does it take 10,000 engineers with a big department?
Oh, that's one question.
Hmm.
So there are a couple of things. First is actually there's work that was done by HBS itself in association with BCG. Where
that's your paper.
That's my paper.
That's Edward's paper. Where and maybe you should talk about it rather than.
I'll let you, but I'm happy to speak on it as well. Yeah.
Okay.
This is full attribution.
It was a massive team, so it wasn't just me, but yeah.
Where they showed that people who were beginners, relative beginners, saw a much bigger boost. And that I think is interesting because that shows you can actually use this for onboarding people a lot more easily, right? Now, in the studies that we had done, in terms of doing at scale, Amazon Code Whisperer, these tools are free for individual users. So, it's only when you're a corporate, then you do that. So part of what we are also trying to do is we think these things are important in general, for the industry, for society. So we are also trying to make it easy for people to use this.
No, I mean, I think that's right. I think that there's a tension where that individuals will see, or in the study we found individuals did increase their individual productivity. And because these tools are helping them think and do things they otherwise may not consider. One thing we did find, this is sort of related to the question I asked you earlier, that I thought was really interesting tension though, was that there was far more similarity in what folks who had GPT produced at the end than those who did not. And so there is this tension of, if you're an organization like a consulting company or something else where you're trying to sort of maximize over the best ideas, then even if I have better ideas than I would have had before, and Iavor has better ideas than he would have had before, but the ideas we come up with in the end, our best ideas are very similar, then the maximization over 10 of us is not as helpful as having one of us. And so there is this tension that I think it's not clear. But I do think that comes from how we use the systems. What we found, a lot of folks did sort of use it very similarly and kind of ask the same kinds of questions. So potentially to the skill question, it becomes, how do we inject our own voice into it in a proper way? I think folks right now don't really know how to do that well. And I think, including myself, to be honest, right? That's not a sort of a slight to anybody, but I think we're not quite sure what is the best way to get the best out of me and it jointly together. And so presumably, if we could do that well, then maybe we could get back to this sort of variety of things, but sort of in the most basic utilization of it that people tend to use right now, there is productivity internally, but there may not be productivity sort of globally across a group of us who are trying to solve the same set of problems.
Yeah.
And you can think of, if I had to use an analogy, let's say when software came in, people would maybe the diversity of algorithms was probably not there. And then as people got really proficient, they would, tweak this and tweak that and make loops tighter and add some hand-coded assembly. And that is when people started thinking in different terms. And to some extent, the prompt engineering part, where as people get more proficient with these tools and provide different kinds of prompts, they can tweak it in different directions. And, some of that will come over time.
Can I just add to this point that Brad made earlier, I think connects to this and what we just said, is that my belief is that when people are interacting with the system, they are programming. We're used to programming with like for loops and code, but like your natural language now programming. So the same way we think about programming of be precise and how do you break down your ideas into small steps. You're programming and you get lost. In fact, you're programming a machine because you're using natural language, but in fact, you're still programming. And so same principles of how we program, I think, need to apply as well as testing. And I think a lot of us don't apply those principles. A lot of us don't make those principles. We're not software developers, all of us, but we don't apply those principles of what's the right way to program this machine. Now it's not clear that I'm programming it because I'm using my natural language.
And as you get more familiar with these tools, you'll kind of start thinking of it as some programming that you're doing with natural language, and then you will start pushing it in directions. You'll start giving it different kind of prompts. You will cause it to search the search space in different ways that we are not doing now. So some of this, I think, will evolve over time, but we have to be cognizant of the things that Edward is talking about.
And just to add, so internally at HBS, what we did this year, so we've got about 1,000 MBA students each year. And this year, for the first time ever, we actually provided all 1,000 of the first year MBA students with ChatGPT Pro accounts because we launched a new data science for managers course. And we didn't give them any instructions. We just said, this advanced data analytics where you can upload the data set, analyze it, it's launched, go have at it so that you can use it for your classes. And what was really interesting, so last week was our final class on this, and I had a whole discussion on sort of their lessons and takeaways from having that. And a lot of them very quickly learned that they basically have to try to interact with it in this sort of programmatized way where you give it extremely clear instructions with a lot of context if you want to get the answers that you're looking for. And it was just quite interesting because, all these students sort of came to the same conclusion, and we're going to, gather some more data on them because this, I think, as far as I know, we're the first business school to try to do something like this, to give them all access to this and just kind of see what happens. And it's been, we had people at both extremes. Some were like, this tool was just terrible. It just kept sending me down the wrong path. And another, they tried to use it for finance classes and they would say, okay, compute this, and they would give it numbers, and then they would just give it the wrong answer. And then other people loved it because it could give them these analogies that were able to get them to understand a new area. So they were using it as sort of a personal tutor. So I think it's really exciting times. I want to go to a question online, which I think is really fascinating. I don't think we've touched on that yet, which is how can GenAI reduce the digital divide? Right, we've got over 2 billion humans without access to the internet. And we have great disparity between those with access, such as advanced technologies, and the ones without. So that's not an easy question, but you said I can ask you hard questions.
Can I actually answer this? That I think for texture, which is like, because I think historically we thought the internet, as which is pointed to as maybe the previous sort of similar sort of great information innovation, was going to in fact reduce the divide, right? It was going to democratize information in ways, and we haven't fully seen that realized even yet. And so I think there's a.
Do you think? I'll answer the question, but just asking, do you think the internet didn't reduce as much as we thought it would, or it didn't reduce at all? Because there's a difference between the two.
That's fair. I guess my personal view is that it did not reduce as much as we thought it would. Maybe as much as I was led to believe it would. I wouldn't say it didn't do it at all.
And I'll tell you why this is important. Because one is, this thing doesn't work at all. The other is, this thing didn't work as much as I wanted it to work, right? Now, if it's in that, and the reason I say that, I ask that is, Gen AI, we have to see how much it actually reduces the digital divide, but I can see ways in which it can reduce the digital divide. So one is, let's say there are lots of people who just know their native language, right? Today, it's very hard for them to get access to the kinds of information that we have. So let's just say I know only Hindi, or I know only whatever language it is, right? You can clearly imagine a world, a few years from now, where ChatGPT, of course, has Amazon Bedrock has an English interface, but you can clearly imagine that in pretty much like, our language services, for example, at AWS, we support like 40, 50, 60 different languages. So pretty much 98 or 99% of all the languages that are spoken, we support in our language services. So you can imagine that a ChatGPT kind of a thing will have such a front end. What this means is every human knows pretty much how to talk and interact in the mother tongue, even if they have not been educated that much. What this means is now you are enabling that individual who may not have had a lot of education, but who knows how to interact in the mother tongue, access to pretty much the world's information in ways that they could not before. And previously, they probably would have to go to school and college and learn a lot of stuff before they do that. So that, I think, can be a great leveler in bridging the digital divide. Will it eliminate it? I don't know, but that is why, I was asking the question to Edward, which is, did it take it in the right direction? I think the other thing that we are going to see, we aren't seeing yet, but I think which we are going to see is, a lot of generative AI today happens in the cloud. And over time, I think we are already seeing that, these models are getting a lot more efficient and will start being able to run on all kinds of devices. Okay. And so when, you're able to run on a device or a mobile device or a phone, and everybody's using it, and they're able to converse in their mother tongue and natural language, I think they'll be able to do stuff that they could not do now.
Yeah, and maybe just to add one example that I saw from one of your competitors, Microsoft, where it was exactly, I think it was in India, and there was a person who couldn't read or write, but they could speak their language. So with generative AI, they were able to fill in a government form because the LM could speak and read it to them, and then they could just say, okay, this is the information I need you to put on there. So it actually enabled them to have access to things that they just otherwise would not have. So I do think, I very much agree with what you said, but I really think this is much more democratizing than the internet itself, because the barrier to entry should be much lower because of its ability to converse in multiple languages through different interfaces, right? The internet very much, even today, is, you read and you look. I mean, now there's pictures and stuff and videos, but that only happened in the past few years. Before, it was very much text-based, which for many people can't engage in that.
I think the ability to interact in your own language opens up new frontiers of inquiry.
Yes.
And, giving them the answers they want. And so I think, there's a vast area to be explored there. And I think, by the way, there's also research to be done. I think there's a lot of, social and business research to be done around how you can use these technologies. There might be particular ways in which these interfaces can be defined to enhance this goal.
So maybe I have a question on that. So the effect of this is basically that generalistic knowledge and maybe even specialistic knowledge becomes easier accessible for everybody. So first of all, does that also have drawbacks, maybe in a disruptive way in the labor market? Maybe what's the consequence of that? And taking that further on a strategic long-term perspective, what are the skill sets and what is the knowledge that makes you competitive as a big company in the long run? Is it informal industry knowledge that can't be captured in the data and therefore not be captured by generative AI? Or what is the long-term strategic consequence of this for big enterprises?
Yeah, why if I complement that with just a clarification question, because then you can answer both. Just want to go back to a point, Edward, that you made in terms of to make sure that I understood it right. that productivity is enhanced at an individual level, but not necessarily in aggregate. Is that correct?
Depending on how you think about productivity of the organization, if its goal is to sort of get the best idea, for example, quickly.
And if that is the case, then this questions a little bit the flywheel idea that we have seen so far with technology that, jobs are created, et cetera. And then I think it's a good background for the question. But thank you for the question.
Ultimately, I think, enterprises or business success is really about velocity of innovation. Right. And I can tell you, generative AI or even LLMs, large language models, aren't going to be the last thing. The next set of models are already coming. In fact, for speech, we ourselves have looked at slightly different kinds of models that perform better. For a lot of vision kind of things, we have looked at models that are better. So, this is just yet another point in what is a continuum of human ingenuity. And I think ultimately companies just have to innovate on behalf of their customers as quickly as they can. That's really, I think, the key thing. And that's not going to stop.
So,
Questions out there, you want to go ahead, yeah.
I have a question on the potential infrastructure bottleneck on this generative AI. Particularly on the computation power and also the general electricity power and also other things that would be needed to facilitate the development of this model. And what do you see the challenges and how to address them?
I think there is a lot of work to be done, which, companies like Amazon and others are doing in terms of making these models a lot more efficient. In fact, I was actually joking about this to someone else. I have a reading list of, papers that I have to catch up with. And, there was recently, maybe 2, 3, 4 months back, a paper came about, which is called LoRa, parameter efficient trading, that makes it a lot more efficient to do this kind of, fine tuning. And so I had it on my reading list. I was like, okay, I'll read it on a weekend. And then before I could get to it, LoRa came about. And I was like, okay. And then, so that also went to my reading list. And then by the time I got to LoRa, and before I could get to those papers, QA LoRa came out, right? And at that point, I said, no, this weekend I got to go and study these papers. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just going up. So I think there's so much innovation going on now in terms of making these a lot more efficient. Like if you see some of these recent models like Llama and Falcon and so on, you're already seeing these models at a much smaller parameter count performing comparably. So I'm very confident that there's a lot of innovation to be done and will continue to happen. And I think that's needed.
And let me go online, one question, then we'll come back to the room. So this question has gotten actually a lot of likes and it's been on here for a little while, so I wanted to make sure we get to it. And it's pulling us back to the healthcare example that you were talking about, which is, so the question is, use of AI in healthcare presents ethical implications around privacy, data security, informed consent, bias, patient autonomy, and others. What guardrails are suggested given the velocity of development? So how do you essentially take all of that?
Yes, so this thing that we created is HIPAA compatible. So, for everything we do is HIPAA, encryption of data at rest and in transit, all of the guardrails that, we put around data use, training data curation, making sure, like we were talking this morning, there's a lot of work we do in putting in place the process so that the training data that you're using is being curated appropriately, the models are being built appropriately, the models are being tested appropriately, the models are being tested along a variety of dimensions. There's accuracy, there's conciseness, there's helpfulness, bunch of dimensions. So there's a lot of work that is going in. I'll probably just use the term industrializing this whole thing, the thing around where something goes from being bespoke to being automated, reliable, robust, industrial grade. There's a lot of work happening, and I think there's a lot of work that still can happen.
Yeah.
These are really important considerations.
Yeah, and I think people very often forget all of the organizational processes that you need in order for AI to actually flourish.
Yeah.
So should we?
And that is why, just one thing, when we were thinking about the topic of this discussion, I had, or as we discussed, we wanted to talk about scaling generative AI in the enterprise.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not just generative AI because you can just leave it out to consumers,
Yes.
but especially at least from an HBS context where you're
Yes.
talking to enterprises, business leaders. I think all of these considerations that you have to go to deploy an enterprise gets really important.
You mentioned enterprise, so if you're a consumer of these tools, right, like your customers, you could be an early adopter or you could be a fast follower. There's some other options, but let's consider that too, right? In general, if you are looking at efficiency gains, like productivity improvements, like it pays to be a fast follower, right? Like the innovators spend all the money, they figure it out, and then everybody benefits, like from the internet and stuff like that. If there's a revenue story, then it pays to be an early adopter because you can actually do like Amazon, right? Grab the first revenue and you can get those exit barriers. What I heard to the earlier question is this is the productivity story right now. The revenue story, people are trying to figure out. So what is the case for being a early adopter if you're an enterprise, as opposed to a fast follower?
I think, so the examples I gave around creation that Motion is using, those are all revenue stories. There is a bunch of other startups, and I'm not trying to talk about our own products, I'm trying to steer clear of them. But there is a bunch of other similar products that are coming in terms of revenue enhancer as well. And I think the important thing I'll say is, if you get in early, then you're able to, there is still a lot of experimentation and exploration to be done. And that iteration to get to the right product and the right usage, I think is important. And that really, there's no, as our CEO, Andy Jassy, likes to say, there's no compression algorithm for experience. And so going in and trying to understand this technology early, I think is really useful.
Yeah. I was just going to add to that. I mean, I think it's important to start experimenting as soon as you can. I mean, I think every company that I speak with, they're all trying to figure out how to experiment with this because the companies that missed the internet and didn't jump on the internet don't exist anymore, right? Or they don't exist to a scale that they used to exist. And they were trying to be fast followers, but it turned out that because that first mover advantage, when you figure that out, lots of companies fail trying to figure it out. When you figure it out, that boost is so huge. And my guess is that we're going to have similar network effects, if not stronger, because they're going to be intimately tied with the learning effects that you get from gathering the data that you're able to then put back into those algorithms. So, I mean, I think companies right now face a really important question, which is how can we experiment with this in a way that allows us to move beyond the productivity and start to do business model innovations, because that's the thing that's really going to be transformative. At least that's sort of my view on that.
I think we had a question that's been held, so I want to grab it.
Yeah, you touched on a few aspects of this question, so I just wanted to see if I could frame it. And I want to think about the mixture between what I'll call horizontal and vertical and large and small models.
Okay.
In other words, one way to think about the future is we're going to have more GPT-4s and GPT-5. There'll be a big horizontal model for which people will then build applications, more specialized usages. Or you could imagine one that is much more vertically oriented, where people build their own much smaller, highly optimized models that are really don't require a GPT-like foundational platform on which to build. And then we have this question of, is the next generation of models going to be 4 trillion parameters, 5 trillion parameters, or do we see more these highly optimized models in the 50, 60, 70 billion parameters that are obviously much more cost efficient to both train and do inference? And it's not an either or, right? The question is, what's the mixture, and how are we going to think about what's the balance between these different ways of building and rolling out these models?
And maybe just to add a little bit to that, right, are these foundational models going to be the death of bespoke models? I think that's in a way kind of what you're asking.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of experimentation going on here. So I'll basically start with that, and it's pretty early days. I'll also say that it will be driven to a large extent by the use case. And I'll give you an example. If you think about document processing, right? And I talk about document processing a lot because every company is swimming in documents and they want to automate the whole thing. If you think about document processing today, then if you take a specialized model, right? And let's say, you're trying to just kind of do some kind of an OCR kind of an activity, like you're just trying to look at the document and see what is written in it. If you want to do that kind of an activity, then a specialized model will get you better or similar accuracy as the best LLM at probably 1,000th the cost. Yeah, we've done these measurements with something of that sort, right? So those cases, you would probably, ultimately in an enterprise, you're trying to also build a business out of it. So, you need to look at your costs as well. The other way of looking at this is the kind of use case. And so let's say in an enterprise setting, I'm probably not trying to ask all kinds of questions to it, right? Like if you're trying to build something that's competing with the search engine where any kind of a question can come to it, and so you need to give an answer to any kind of a question, then you probably need a gigantic model. Whereas let's say in the health scribe example that I talked about, the doctor, the patient isn't going to ask, who won the Super Bowl in '88. Hopefully that's not the conversation that the doctor and physician are having. So in those scenarios, we are looking at, okay, if you're having this thing in this context, I need to fit a cost envelope. We have also seen that a small amount of additional training data, the fine-tuning aspect, makes a very significant difference, right? Like we in Health Scribe, we tested a lot of models. We did not take the largest model, right? And you can take a smaller model, train it on data and code. So I would say, it is going to be use case driven. And I think ultimately you're going to end up in a situation where the use case will matter, the cost profile will matter, and that is going to drive a lot of this. There are some use cases that you cannot do without generative AI. Like summarize this paragraph, you can't do that. But there will be cases that you can use smaller specialized models and you'll use that. Now there's a second question here, which I think is implicit, but you didn't ask it, so I'll answer it anyway, which is, how are you getting to that? How are you going to get to that smaller model? You can get to the smaller model in two ways. One is you start with a smaller model and you just train it. The other is you go to a large foundation model and then you compress it down. And there are various ways to do it, quantization, distillation. And I think, in some cases you'll go back up and come down. In some cases you'll just go straight down.
So looking at the time, we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to ask a sort of final question, which is, what advice do you have for leaders and board members, CEOs, etc., on their strategy around generative AI?
I think it's very similar to what you said, which is it's really important to get started. It's really important to explore this technology. You don't want to wait for it to mature, because if you want to wait for it to mature, then you may end up being too late. And the question I would ask a CEO or a board member is, if your company was founded today after GenAI was created, what would your company look like? Your company was founded in the pre-GenAI era, and therefore your processes and thinking is a particular way. But if you could just start all over again today, what would it look like? And if it would look very different, as it's likely would look, then what about the startups and other companies that are coming up now? Are they going to fundamentally disrupt you?
Yeah. And
to prevent that disruption, you better understand this technology and get started with it quickly.
Yes, so you want to disrupt yourself, really. And on that, we're out of time, so let's thank Bratin.
Thank you.
And thank you all for here in person, and thank you all for joining remotely. I'm sorry we could not get to all of the questions, but yeah, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you.
Cool.